The asphalt shimmered under the brutal August sun, radiating heat that buckled the air above Forest Avenue. Shreveport sweltered, the humidity clinging like a damp shroud. Cicadas droned their incessant song from the oaks lining the street, a soundtrack to the oppressive stillness. Nyla Freeman, her thoughts miles away, absently adjusted the strap of her bag as she walked, the sidewalk radiating heat through the thin soles of her sandals. She was contemplating the complexities of a recent internal affairs case, the moral ambiguities swirling in her mind like the dust motes dancing in the afternoon sunbeams. She hadn't noticed the patrol car pull up beside her, its sudden presence breaking her concentration like a shattered mirror. "Hey, stop right there." The voice, amplified by the patrol car speaker, was harsh, laced with an undercurrent of aggression that Nyla recognized instantly. The instinctive tightening in her stomach, a feeling she'd learned to associate with impending trouble, was immediate. She stopped, a frown creasing her brow. The world, which had been a hazy backdrop to her thoughts, suddenly snapped into sharp focus. A figure emerged from the vehicle, his bulk filling the doorway. Officer Brad Timmons. His name echoed in her mind, a whisper of notoriety. Rumors of his short temper and heavy-handed tactics had circulated within the department, but nothing concrete enough to warrant a formal investigation. "Let me see your hands," he barked, his voice closer now, carrying the weight of his authority. He approached her, his gait swaggering, almost predatory. Nyla's mind raced. Her initial confusion morphed into a cold, hard knot of anger. He doesn't recognize me. The thought was a chilling realization. She was in plain clothes, but even so, his blatant disregard for protocol was alarming. This wasn't a routine stop. This was a display of power. He was using the weight of his badge to intimidate, and the simmering anger within her began to boil. She slowly raised her hands, her movements deliberate, controlled. Maintaining her composure was paramount. "Sir, I think you've got the wrong person," she said, her voice level, betraying none of the turmoil churning inside. Timmons stopped inches from her, his shadow falling over her like a dark cloud. His eyes, narrowed and scrutinizing, scanned her face. He seemed to be searching for something, a flicker of fear, a hint of submission. He wouldn't find it. Years of working internal affairs had honed Nyla's ability to mask her emotions, to project an aura of calm even in the face of hostility. She met his gaze, unflinching. "Wrong person," he scoffed, a sneer twisting his lips. "You fit the description. Suspicious behavior." His words were clipped, dismissive. He didn't believe her, or perhaps he simply didn't care. The air crackled with unspoken tension. The cicadas seemed to fall silent, the oppressive heat amplifying the suffocating feeling in Nyla's chest. "He's enjoying this," she realized with a sickening certainty. "He's relishing the power." Before she could respond, before she could even process the thought fully, a sharp crack echoed through the still afternoon air. The world spun. A searing pain bloomed on her cheek, radiating outwards like a shockwave. Disbelief warred with the rising tide of fury within her. She staggered back a step, her hand instinctively flying to her stinging face. The world seemed to slow down, the sounds of the city fading into a muffled drone. She could see Timmons's face, contorted in a mixture of anger and something else, something darker, that sent a shiver down her spine. She saw the shock register on the faces of the few bystanders who had gathered, their expressions mirroring her own disbelief. A phone camera flashed, capturing the scene in stark detail. The image, she knew, would burn itself into her memory, a permanent reminder of this violation. Nyla took a deep breath, forcing herself to remain still, to control the rage that threatened to consume her. This wasn't just about her. This was about the system, the culture of impunity that allowed men like Timmons to operate without consequence. This was about the countless others who had suffered similar indignities, whose voices had been silenced by fear. She would not be silenced. This slap, this single act of violence, would be his undoing. It was a turning point, a catalyst. The quiet war within the department, The battle against corruption and abuse of power had just escalated. And she, Sergeant Nyla Freeman, was now at the forefront. The throbbing pain in her cheek was a constant reminder, a physical manifestation of the fight she was about to wage. The sting resonated, not so much on her cheek, but deep within the hollows of her self-respect. Nyla Freeman didn't flinch. Not outwardly. Inside, a storm raged, a hurricane of disbelief and simmering fury threatening to tear through her carefully constructed composure. 5 years in internal affairs had taught her control. 5 years of navigating the murky waters of police misconduct, of facing down men just like this one arrogant, entitled, drunk on a power they barely understood. He struck me. The thought echoed in her mind, each repetition amplifying the absurdity. Not a shove, not a brush of contact, a full-blown, open-handed slap. The heat on her cheek was a brand, a mark of disrespect that burned hotter than any physical pain. He was still yelling, something about resisting arrest, about showing some respect. His words were a meaningless drone, buzzing around her like irritating flies. Nyla registered the growing crowd, the murmurs, the gasps. Their eyes, wide with shock, were mirrors reflecting her own incredulity. She didn't need their pity. She needed clarity. Think, Nyla. This wasn't just about her. This was about the uniform he wore, the badge that shielded him, the system that enabled him. Bending down, she collected her fallen belongings, her ID, her phone, her dignity scattered on the asphalt like broken glass. Each piece she picked up was a fragment of her resolve, slowly piecing itself back together. Brad Timons, chest puffed out like a preening rooster, watched her. He hadn't expected that reaction. No screaming, no fighting back, just stillness. It unnerved him. He'd been aiming for fear, for submission. He thrived on the power it gave him, the way it shrank people, made them small and insignificant. But her stillness, it felt like defiance. Damn woman. He could practically taste the bile rising in his throat, a bitter cocktail of anger and unease. He hadn't even meant to hit her that hard. It just happened. The adrenaline, the alcohol, the sheer frustration of the day, it had all culminated in that single, explosive act. Now, the murmurs of the crowd were growing louder, sharper. He could feel their judgment, their disapproval radiating towards him like waves of heat. He shifted uncomfortably, the sudden sobriety hitting him like a slap of its own. She was resisting, he mumbled, the words sounding hollow even to his own ears. She shouldn't have interfered. Around them, the bystanders exchanged hushed whispers, their voices laced with disbelief. What the hell? Did he just hit her? A young woman with vibrant pink hair breathed, her hand covering her mouth. She going to sue the hell out of him. A man in a faded baseball cap muttered, shaking his head. An older woman, her face etched with weariness, observed Nyla's retreating figure. Her voice, low and steady, cut through the murmuring crowd. Nah, she ain't going to sue. That woman's about to do something way worse. Nyla walked away, each step measured, deliberate. She could feel the weight of their stares, the unspoken questions hanging in the air. Let them watch. Let them witness the calm before the storm. The slap itself was a symptom, a festering wound exposed. But the infection ran deeper, seeping into the very foundations of the precinct, of the force itself. And she, Nyla Freeman, was the surgeon. This wasn't about revenge. It was about accountability. It was about justice. It was about dismantling the rotten structure, brick by painstaking brick. Timons was just the beginning. Unbeknownst to them, a silent observer had captured the entire incident. A young man, no older than 18, stood on the fringes of the crowd, his phone held steady. The video, shaky but clear, documented the escalating argument, the sudden explosion of violence, and Nyla's chillingly composed reaction. With a few taps on his screen, he uploaded the video to social media. A single click, a ripple effect. Within minutes, the video was being shared, retweeted, commented on. The digital wildfire spread, igniting a blaze of outrage that transcended the confines of Forest Avenue. Back in his patrol car, Brad Timons tried to regain his composure. He swiped a hand across his sweaty forehead, his heart hammering against his ribs. He needed to report this, to get his story straight. But the words wouldn't come. His carefully constructed narrative, the one where he was the victim, the one where she was the aggressor, crumbled under the weight of his own actions. Damn it. He knew he should have called for backup. He knew he should have followed protocol. But protocol was for rookies, for those who hadn't yet learned the unspoken rules of the street, the delicate dance of power and influence. He was Brad Timons. He made the rules. Or so he thought. Nyla didn't look back. She didn't need to. She knew the eyes of the city were on her now, watching, waiting. The pressure was immense, a crushing weight on her shoulders. But beneath that weight, a flicker of something else ignited. Not anger, not fear, but a cold, hard determination. She was a soldier in a war no one knew was being fought. And tonight, the battle lines had been drawn. The stale, metallic tang of old coffee hung heavy in the precinct's air, a scent so familiar it had become part of the very fabric of the building. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting a sterile glow on the worn linoleum floor. The low murmur of police radio chatter created a constant, almost hypnotic backdrop to the morning's routines. Brad Timons leaned against the break room counter, a smirk playing on his lips. He recounted the previous night's incident with an exaggerated swagger, his voice laced with a self-satisfied amusement that grated on the nerves of anyone within earshot. Did you see her face? She froze like a deer. Classic. A ripple of laughter followed his words, fueled by the nervous energy that always seemed to accompany Timons's presence. He held court, relishing the attention, the validation of his peers a potent drug. Inside, a small voice whispered that something wasn't right, a prickle of unease he quickly suppressed. This was how things worked, wasn't it? He was Brad Timons. Rules bent for him. They always had. He took a swig of his coffee, the bitter taste grounding him in the familiar comfort of his own power. Detective Tay Saunders sat at a nearby table, pretending to be engrossed in a file, but his gaze kept drifting back to Timons. He'd seen the video, the raw footage before it had exploded across social media. The slap, the stunned silence of the woman, the casual indifference of Timons. As he walked away, it had all churned a familiar sickness in his stomach. A sickness he'd learned to ignore. Speaking up meant ostracization, the subtle but devastating shunning that came with challenging the established order. He'd witnessed it happen to others. Careers stalled, reputations tarnished, all for the sake of speaking truth to power. The file in his hands felt heavy, the weight of his own silence pressing down on him. He rubbed his temples, the throbbing pressure a mirror of the anxiety tightening in his chest. He'd convinced himself it wasn't his fight, not his problem. But now, watching Timons bask in the twisted glory of his actions, something shifted within him. A tiny crack in the wall of indifference he'd so carefully constructed. He'd seen the woman before, he realized with a sudden jolt. Not just in the video. There was a familiarity, a nagging sense of recognition. Timons continued his boastful narrative, embellishing details, painting himself as the victim of an oversensitive public. These civilians, he scoffed, they think they can get away with anything. Need to be taught a lesson. He punctuated his statement with a dismissive wave of his hand. The other officers chuckled, eager to appease the alpha of their pack. Inside, Timons felt a flicker of doubt, a fleeting awareness of the precariousness of his position. But he pushed it down, burying it beneath layers of bravado and self-justification. He'd weathered storms before. He'd come out unscathed. This would be no different, wouldn't it? Saunders' mind raced, sifting through memories, searching for the elusive connection. He'd seen her around the precinct. That much he was sure of. But where? When? The details remained frustratingly out of reach. He closed his eyes, focusing on the image of her face from the video. The calm, steady gaze, the controlled stillness, even in the face of aggression, it spoke of a strength that went beyond mere stoicism. It was the kind of strength that came from knowing who you were, from an unwavering sense of purpose. He opened his eyes, his gaze fixed on Timons, a new clarity dawning in his mind. He remembered now. The awards ceremony last year. The woman standing beside Captain Harper. The name tag. Sergeant. Internal Affairs. Sergeant Nyla Freeman. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. He sucked in a sharp breath, the air catching in his throat. This wasn't just a civilian. This was one of their own. This was internal affairs. The implications of this realization rippled through him, sending a chill down his spine. Timotz hadn't just slapped a random woman. He'd assaulted a fellow officer, an internal affairs officer. The rules had just changed. Everything had just changed. The laughter around Timotz suddenly felt jarring, almost obscene. He looked at the other officers, their faces flushed with amusement, their eyes gleaming with a mixture of admiration and fear. Did they know who she was? Did they understand the magnitude of what they were condoning? He looked back at Timotz, his smirk now a grotesque mask, his words a hollow echo in the suddenly charged air. Saunders felt a knot of dread tightening in his stomach. This wasn't just a mistake anymore. This was a declaration of war. And he, whether he liked it or not, was now a witness, a participant. He could no longer afford the luxury of silence. The wall he had so carefully constructed had crumbled, leaving him exposed, vulnerable. But amidst the fear, a flicker of something else began to stir. A sense of grim determination, a resolve he hadn't known he possessed. He knew what he had to do. He had to speak. The fluorescent lights of the precinct hummed, a dull, persistent drone that mirrored the tension tightening Captain Harper's chest. The air hung thick and stale, a familiar blend of coffee, sweat, and the faint metallic tang of gun oil. She stood by the window, the cityscape a blurred gray canvas against the overcast sky. Her reflection stared back, a woman etched with weariness, her shoulders slumping beneath the weight of the morning's news. The video. It played on a loop in her mind, a sickening replay of Timontz's hand connecting with the woman's face. Harper's stomach churned. This wasn't just bad PR. It was a blatant abuse of power, a stain on the badge she wore. A stain that, she knew, would spread if not contained quickly. Damn it, Timotz. The man was a liability, a walking time bomb she'd been meaning to address. His arrogance, his casual disregard for protocol, it had been brewing for too long. Now it had boiled over, scalding them all. Harper rubbed her temples, the throbbing pressure a grim reminder of the headache this was going to become. She had to act, and act decisively. This wasn't going to go away. The phone buzzed on her desk. Send Timotz to the briefing room. She ordered, her voice clipped, each word punctuated by the unspoken weight of the situation. She turned from the window, the city's indifferent sprawl no longer holding her gaze. Her focus narrowed, laser-sharp on the task at hand. Damage control and justice, a small, flickering flame of hope in the gathering storm. The heavy door of the precinct swung open, admitting Sergeant Nyla Freeman. The morning air, still cool and damp, swirled around her, a brief, almost imperceptible disturbance in the stagnant atmosphere. She moved with a quiet confidence, her steps measured, her gaze steady, seemingly unaffected by the storm brewing within those walls. Her expression was unreadable, a carefully constructed mask that betrayed nothing of the turmoil she might be feeling. Harper watched her approach, a flicker of admiration and perhaps a touch of guilt rising within her. Freeman was everything Timotz wasn't. Disciplined, composed, a model officer. And yet, it was Freeman who had been wronged. He hit her. The thought echoed in Harper's mind, a raw, visceral reminder of the injustice that had unfolded. The weight on her chest intensified. Freeman's eyes met Harper's across the room, a silent acknowledgement passing between them. No words were needed. The video had spoken volumes. The silence stretched, heavy with unspoken accusations, with a shared understanding of the precarious situation. It was Freeman who broke the silence, her voice calm and even, betraying none of the inner turmoil that Harper suspected simmered beneath the surface. "Captain Harper," she acknowledged, a slight incline of her head. Her eyes, however, remained fixed on Harper's, searching, assessing. "Freeman," Harper replied, her voice strained. "I saw the video. We need to talk." The words hung in the air, heavy with implication. They were the opening salvo in a battle that had only just begun. A battle for truth, for accountability, and for the soul of the precinct itself. Harper's gaze shifted towards the briefing room, where Timance waited, oblivious to the storm gathering around him. He'll learn soon enough. The thought offered a sliver of grim satisfaction. Freeman's internal monologue ran a counterpoint to the outward calm she projected. He thought I would break. He thought I would crumble under the weight of his arrogance, his power. A flicker of something cold and hard, something she rarely acknowledged, sparked in her chest. He underestimated me. Every controlled breath, every measured step was a testament to her resolve. She had been trained for this, not for the physical blow itself, but for the aftermath, the subtle dance of power and politics that followed. She knew the system. She knew its flaws, its loopholes, its ingrained biases, and she knew how to navigate them. This isn't just about me. The thought resonated within her, a quiet, unwavering conviction. This is about every officer who has been silenced, every injustice that has been swept under the rug. The slap, the humiliation, the public spectacle, it had all fueled a fire within her, a burning need to expose the rot that festered within the department. He will fall. The certainty of it settled within her, a cold, hard knot of resolve. She wouldn't break. She wouldn't yield. She would fight. The precinct hummed around them, a hive of activity oblivious to the silent storm brewing in its heart. The clatter of keyboards, the murmur of conversations, the ringing of phones, it all faded into the background, a muted soundtrack to the drama unfolding between Harper and Freeman. The air crackled with unspoken tension, a palpable energy that seemed to vibrate in the space between them. The city outside, glimpsed through the grimy window, continued its relentless rhythm, indifferent to the human drama unfolding within these walls. But inside, the wheels of justice, however slowly, had begun to turn. The muted hum of the fluorescent lights seemed to amplify the silence in Captain Harper's office. Sunlight, fractured by the blinds, cast thin stripes across the polished wooden desk, a stark contrast to the storm brewing within Nyla. She could feel the weight of her badge pressing against her chest, a physical reminder of the oath she had sworn. Her fingers, laced together in her lap, felt cold despite the warmth of the room. Control, Freeman, she told herself, the words a silent mantra against the thrumming pulse in her temples. She had rehearsed this moment countless times in the sterile quiet of her apartment. Each word, each inflection, a carefully placed stone in the edifice of her complaint. Captain Harper sat behind her desk, her face an impassive mask. The lines around her eyes, etched deep by years on the force, seemed to deepen with each passing second. Nyla could practically hear the gears turning in the captain's head, the silent calculations of political maneuvering, the weighing of risk against reward. The air in the room thickened with unspoken tension. Across from Nyla, Brad Timance shifted uneasily in his chair. His usual swagger had evaporated, replaced by a simmering resentment that radiated off him in waves. He avoided her gaze, his eyes darting around the room, momentarily landing on the framed commendation hanging on the wall before flicking away. Nyla wondered if he remembered the day he received it, if he recalled the pride he must have felt. Now, that pride was replaced by a cornered animal's desperation. He ran a hand through his hair, the gesture betraying a nervousness he desperately tried to conceal. He thinks he can charm his way out of this, Nyla thought, her stomach clenching. He thinks this is just another hurdle he can clear with a wink and a handshake. But this time it was different. This time, there was a digital witness that had captured his transgression and broadcast it to the world. Captain Harper cleared her throat, the sound breaking the strained silence. "Sergeant Freeman," she began, her voice neutral, "I understand you have a formal complaint to file against Officer Timance." Nyla met the captain's gaze, her own unwavering. "Yes, Captain," she replied, her voice steady, each word precise. "Officer Timance assaulted me in public. She could see a flicker of something in Harper's eyes, annoyance, perhaps, or maybe a hint of weariness. The weariness of dealing with yet another internal conflict, another stain on the department's already tarnished reputation. Timon scoffed, the sound sharp and derisive. Assault? She's exaggerating. It was a misunderstanding. He leaned forward, his voice laced with a condescending charm. I mistook her for a civilian. It was dark. Things happened. Nyla felt a surge of anger, hot and prickly, threatened to break through her carefully constructed composure. She took a deep breath, forcing herself to remain calm. This is what he expects. He expects an outburst. He expects me to lose control. But she wouldn't give him the satisfaction. You approached without cause, Nyla stated, her voice level, her gaze fixed on Timon's. Used excessive force, she continued, and walked away without a report. The words hung in the air, heavy with accusation. Each phrase was a deliberate blow, chipping away at the wall of impunity Timons had built around himself. He opened his mouth to retort, but Nyla cut him off. The entire incident was recorded, Officer Timons. I have multiple witnesses, and the video evidence is irrefutable. Timons's face paled. The bravado he had been clinging to seemed to crumble, leaving behind a stark vulnerability. He looked from Nyla to Captain Harper, a silent plea for intervention. Harper, however, remained impassive. Her silence stretched, each second amplifying the tension in the room. Finally, she sighed, the sound heavy with resignation. Officer Timons, she said, her voice devoid of any warmth. You are hereby placed on administrative leave pending a full investigation. The words seemed to echo in the silence that followed. Timons stared at her, his eyes wide with disbelief. But, Captain, he stammered, the words dying in his throat. He looked at Nyla, his gaze filled with a mixture of anger and fear. Nyla met his gaze, her expression unwavering. She felt a small flicker of satisfaction, a cold ember glowing in the pit of her stomach. It was a small victory, a single crack in the system, but it was a start. The fight was far from over, she knew. The entrenched culture of silence, the web of connections and favors, would not be easily dismantled. But in this small, sterile office, a shift had occurred. The scales of power had tipped, ever so slightly, and Nyla knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her bones, that she would not rest until justice was served. The silence of her apartment pressed in on Nyla. The muted hum of the refrigerator, usually a comforting background noise, now seemed to amplify the emptiness. The viral video, the sting of Timon's hand, the whispers she could almost hear echoing from the precinct, it all swirled in her mind. A chaotic storm she fought to contain. She picked up the glass of water on her nightstand, the cool liquid a stark contrast to the heat rising in her chest. Each sip was a conscious effort, a small act of reclaiming control. This wasn't just about her. It was about every civilian who had faced similar injustice, every officer who had turned a blind eye. This was about the integrity of the badge, tarnished by men like Timons. She set the glass down, the faint click echoing in the quiet. The storm within hadn't subsided, but a steely resolve had begun to crystallize. At the precinct, the air was thick with unspoken tension. The usual banter was replaced by hushed conversations, furtive glances. Nyla felt the weight of those glances, the curiosity, the speculation, perhaps even a hint of pity. She ignored it all. Her focus was laser-sharp, each step purposeful as she navigated the familiar corridors. Her office, a small, functional space, offered a temporary sanctuary. She sat down, the worn leather of the chair familiar beneath her. The computer screen flickered to life, the blank document a stark invitation. This was where she would begin to build her case, brick by meticulous brick. The first call was to Officer Ruiz, the patrol officer who had accompanied Timons that night. His voice was hesitant, laced with a nervousness Nyla could almost taste. Sergeant Freeman, he began, his tone formal, almost strained. She could picture him, fidgeting, avoiding her gaze. I didn't see anything. A lie. Nyla knew it. She could hear it in the tremor in his voice, the slight pause before he spoke. Officer Ruiz, she said, her voice calm, controlled. You were there. You saw what happened. Another pause. Longer this time. I can't get involved, Sergeant. The click of the disconnected line resonated in the small office. Cowardice, she thought. A common disease. But she wouldn't let it deter her. Her next interview was with Detective Saunders. He had a reputation for being a good cop, but also for keeping his head down. Nyla found him in the break room, staring into a mug of lukewarm coffee. He looked up as she approached, his eyes filled with a weariness that mirrored her own. Detective Saunders, she said, her voice soft, almost conversational. I need to ask you a few questions about Officer Timotz. He didn't answer, just kept staring at the coffee, the swirling liquid a metaphor for the murky waters they were about to navigate. You knew, she said, the statement hanging in the air between them. He finally looked up, his gaze meeting hers. I suspected, he admitted, the words barely a whisper. The admission, though quiet, felt like a crack in the wall of silence she was trying to dismantle. Days blurred into a relentless pursuit of evidence. Nyla reviewed incident reports, cross-referenced witness statements, pieced together a mosaic of Timon's misconduct. The pattern was clear: excessive force, intimidation, disregard for protocol. It was all there, hidden in plain sight, buried beneath layers of bureaucratic indifference. The weight of it settled on her shoulders, a heavy cloak of responsibility. But she wouldn't falter. She couldn't. This was bigger than just one officer, one incident. This was about systemic rot, about a culture that allowed such behavior to flourish. The turning point came unexpectedly. A late-night call from an anonymous source led her to a forgotten storage locker. Inside, a small flash drive. Its contents were explosive. Videos, audio recordings, documented instances of Timon's brutality, his casual disregard for the law, the complicity of other officers. It was the smoking gun, the irrefutable proof she needed. As she watched the videos, a cold rage settled in her heart. This wasn't just about a slap anymore. This was about years of unchecked abuse, years of silenced victims. The digital images flickered on the screen, each frame a testament to Timon's arrogance, his cruelty. Nyla felt a surge of something akin to triumph, but it was quickly tempered by a profound sadness. The damage was done, the trust broken. But perhaps, just perhaps, this was the beginning of healing, the start of a long, overdue reckoning. The flash drive felt heavy in her hand, a tangible representation of the burden she carried. But it was also a weapon, a tool for justice, and she would wield it with precision. The silence of her apartment no longer felt oppressive. It was now the quiet before the storm, a storm she was ready to unleash. The silence of the Internal Affairs office on a Saturday morning was a peculiar thing. It lacked the usual weekday hum of forced professionalism, the clatter of keyboards, the hushed anxieties whispered behind partition walls. Instead, a sterile quiet pressed in, amplifying the rhythmic tick of the clock on the wall. Nyla found the emptiness both unsettling and liberating. It was a space where she could dissect the events of the past week, where the raw, throbbing bruise on her cheekbone felt less like a public spectacle and more like a private ache. She ran a thumb over the tender skin, a small, repetitive gesture that anchored her to the present. He hit me. The thought, stark and undeniable, still echoed in the hollow chambers of her mind. Brad Timotz, a name that had once been just another entry in the precinct roster, now a weight pressing down on her chest, constricting her breath. She'd requested access to Timon's personnel file, a standard procedure, though Captain Harper had hesitated, a flicker of apprehension in her eyes. Nyla understood the hesitation. Timon's had connections, strings that reach high up the chain of command. But the video, the undeniable evidence of his brutality, had forced Harper's hand. The file, thick and worn, sat on Nyla's desk, a testament to years of service, commendations interspersed with a few reprimands, quickly dismissed, swept under the rug. A familiar pattern. They protect their own. The thought was a bitter taste in her mouth. She'd seen it before, the subtle manipulations, the coded language, the way accountability seemed to evaporate when it concerned one of their own. This time, though, it felt different. The video, the public outcry, the sheer brazenness of the assault, it had created a crack in the wall of silence, a fissure she intended to widen. Beneath the file, almost hidden in its shadow, lay a small, unassuming flash drive. It hadn't been listed in the file's inventory. An oversight? Or something more deliberate? Nyla picked it up, turning it over in her fingers. It was unmarked, generic, the kind easily overlooked, easily dismissed. A knot of unease tightened in her stomach. "Were you hiding, Timons?" The question hung in the air, unanswered, a silent challenge. Her fingers hovered over her keyboard. A brief hesitation, a fleeting thought of protocol, of chain of command. Then a quiet defiance. She plugged the drive in. The computer whirred, the screen flickered, and a folder opened, revealing a jumble of files. Dates, times, cryptic labels. Nyla clicked on the first one, her heart pounding a slow, heavy rhythm against her ribs. The video began to play. It wasn't from a body camera. The angle was wrong, the quality grainy, the sound distorted. Dashcam footage, perhaps, from an older model. The date stamp in the corner read 6 months prior. The scene unfolded on the screen, grainy and unsettling. A traffic stop. A teenager pulled over for a broken taillight. The boy, no older than 17, hands trembled as he fumbled for his license. Timons's voice, sharp and laced with aggression, filled the small office. The boy flinched, a visible tremor running through his thin frame. Then the camera angle shifted abruptly, obscured by a shadow, the audio cutting out momentarily. When the image cleared, the boy was on the ground, Timons's knee pressed into his back, his voice a low, menacing growl. Nyla watched, her breath catching in her throat, a cold dread spreading through her veins. This wasn't standard procedure. This was brutality. She watched the video again, and then again, each time noticing new details, the boy's desperate pleas, Timons's smug indifference, the casual way he adjusted his uniform afterward, as if nothing out of the ordinary had occurred. She closed her eyes, the image burned into her mind, the boy's fear a tangible presence in the quiet office. This wasn't just about her anymore. This was about a pattern of abuse, a system that protected its own, even at the expense of justice. The flash drive, the hidden evidence, it was a confirmation of her suspicions, a validation of the unease that had gnawed at her for years. Nyla leaned back in her chair, the silence of the office now a different kind of quiet. It was no longer empty, but filled with the weight of what she had discovered, the implications of the truth she now held in her hands. The bruise on her cheekbone throbbed, a reminder of the personal cost of this fight. But in that moment, the pain was a strange comfort, a testament to her resolve. This wasn't just about her. This was about every victim silenced, every injustice ignored, every crack in the system that had been carefully papered over. This was about breaking the cycle. And she, Nyla Freeman, would be the one to do it. The fluorescent lights of the conference room hummed, a sterile counterpoint to the tension thickening the air. Captain Denise Harper sat at the head of the mahogany table, the wood's polished surface reflecting the grim lines etched on her face. Each breath felt like a lead weight in her chest, a physical manifestation of the pressure bearing down. This meeting, this moment, would define not only Brad Timons's future, but also the future of the precinct, perhaps even the entire department. Her gaze swept across the faces assembled city attorneys, representatives from internal affairs, and a handful of senior officers. Each one a silent participant in a drama that had unfolded with the brutal swiftness of a viral video. Nyla Freeman sat quietly, a still figure amidst the storm brewing within the room. Her hands, clasped calmly in her lap, belied the tempest of emotions swirling within her. The viral video, the slap, the public outcry, it had all become a surreal blur. She'd expected resistance, the subtle pushback of a system protecting its own. But the sheer magnitude of the response, the groundswell of support from unexpected corners, had surprised her. It had given her a flicker of hope, a fragile belief that maybe, just maybe, things could change. Across the table, Brad Timons shifted uneasily in his chair. His usual swagger was replaced by a nervous twitch in his jaw, his eyes darting from face to face, searching for an ally, a hint of support. He'd underestimated the fallout, the ripple effect of that single, impulsive act. He'd relied on his connections, the unspoken code of silence that had protected him before. But this time, the silence had been broken, shattered by the cold, unflinching lens of a bystander's phone. Lieutenant Grace Hollow, a seasoned veteran of internal affairs from a neighboring precinct, laid a thick file on the table. The thud echoed in the tense silence. "This," she said, her voice sharp and precise, "is the culmination of a week-long investigation into Officer Timons's conduct." Her gaze, sharp and unwavering, met Timons's. He flinched, a fleeting flicker of fear crossing his face. He'd seen that look before, the look of a predator closing in on its prey. Inside, Nyla felt a tight knot of satisfaction unfurl. Hollow's presence, her unwavering commitment to the truth, had been a beacon in the unsettling days since the incident. She navigated the murky waters of internal politics with an almost unnerving calm, dismantling Timons's carefully constructed defenses brick by brick. Captain Harper cleared her throat, the sound amplified in the quiet room. "Lieutenant Hollow," she began, her voice betraying a trace of weariness, "please summarize your findings for the board." Hollow opened the file, the crisp rustle of paper a counterpoint to the drumming in Timons's ears. He swallowed hard, the dryness in his throat a sudden, choking sensation. He'd heard whispers, rumors of Hollow's reputation. She was known as a pit bull, tenacious and relentless. Now, facing her across the table, he understood why. "Our investigation reveals a disturbing pattern of behavior on the part of Officer Timons," Hollow stated, her voice devoid of emotion. "Multiple instances of excessive force, verbal abuse, and disregard for proper procedure. These incidents, documented and corroborated by witness testimonies, paint a clear picture of an officer operating outside the boundaries of the law." With each word, Timons felt the walls closing in. The room seemed to shrink, the air growing thick and suffocating. He wanted to speak, to defend himself, but the words were trapped in his throat, choked by a rising tide of panic. "This isn't just about one isolated incident," Hollow continued, her voice rising slightly. "This is a pattern of behavior it's targeted. It's abusive, and it's been protected by a lack of oversight." Her gaze shifted to Captain Harper, the unspoken accusation hanging heavy in the air. Harper met her gaze, a flicker of shame crossing her face. She knew Hollow was right. She'd seen the warning signs, the whispers of discontent, but she'd chosen to ignore them, to maintain the fragile peace of the precinct. Now, that peace had been shattered, and the consequences were laid bare on the table before her. The city attorneys, their faces impassive, began to speak, their voices a dry recitation of legal jargon. Timons's termination was a foregone conclusion, a formality played out for the record. The possibility of criminal charges hung in the air, a heavy, unspoken threat. As the meeting drew to a close, Nyla felt a strange sense of emptiness. Justice had been served, but at what cost? The system, flawed and broken, had finally corrected itself, but only after being forced to confront its own failings. The silence that had protected Timons had been broken, but the cracks in the foundation remained. Leaving the conference room, Nyla walked alongside Lieutenant Hollow. The hallway was quiet, the fluorescent lights casting long, sterile shadows. "Thank you," Nyla said, her voice quiet, but filled with a depth of gratitude. Hollow met her gaze, a flicker of something akin to understanding passing between them. "It wasn't just me," she replied, her voice softening slightly. "It was you, your courage, your refusal to be silenced. That's what made the difference." Nyla looked away, a wave of complex emotions washing over her. She hadn't sought to be a hero, a catalyst for change. She'd simply wanted justice, accountability. But in that pursuit, she'd stumbled upon something larger, something that resonated far beyond the walls of the precinct. The fight wasn't over, not by a long shot. The systemic issues, the ingrained biases, they still remained. But in this moment, in the quiet aftermath of the storm, Nyla felt a flicker of hope. The silence had been broken. The truth had been revealed. And perhaps, just perhaps, that was enough to begin the long, arduous process of healing, of rebuilding, of creating a system worthy of the trust placed in it. The weight in her chest hadn't entirely lifted, but it had shifted, leaving space for something new, something fragile, something that resembled hope. The stale air in Brad Timon's apartment hung heavy with the scent of cheap beer and despair. Empty pizza boxes littered the coffee table, a testament to days spent in a self-imposed exile. The curtains were drawn, casting the room in a perpetual twilight that mirrored the gloom in his heart. He hadn't slept properly in days. The replay of the incident, the slap, the stunned silence of the crowd, the cold fury in Freeman's eyes, a constant, agonizing loop in his mind. He'd known, somewhere deep down, that his unchecked arrogance would catch up to him eventually. But knowing something and truly understanding it were two different beasts entirely. Now, the weight of his actions crushed him, the isolation a physical ache in his chest. He ran a hand through his hair, the gesture rough, almost violent. He'd lost everything. His job, his reputation, the warped sense of power he'd clung to so tightly. He'd become a pariah, a cautionary tale whispered in the precinct hallways. Even his so-called friends, the ones who'd enabled him, who'd laughed at his jokes, now avoided his calls, their silence more damning than any accusation. He picked up his phone, the screen reflecting his haggard face. He scrolled through his contacts, a flicker of desperation igniting within him. Who could he call? Who would even listen? The atmosphere at the precinct had shifted, a palpable change that settled over the officers like a fine dust. The casual banter, once punctuated with Timons's booming laughter, was now subdued, laced with a new kind of caution. The easy camaraderie felt strained, replaced by a nervous energy. Every conversation seemed to carry an undercurrent of the incident, an unspoken acknowledgement of the fault lines that had been exposed within their ranks. Detective Saunders, usually a man of few words, found himself drawn into whispered conversations, the guilt of his past silence a heavy weight on his conscience. He'd seen Timons's behavior escalate, the casual disregard for procedure morphing into something more sinister. He'd justified his inaction with a potent cocktail of fear and self-preservation. Now, witnessing the fallout, he understood the true cost of his silence. He'd contributed to the toxic environment, allowed it to fester and grow. The shame was a constant, gnawing presence. Captain Harper stood in the doorway of Timons's apartment, her expression a carefully neutral mask. She debated this visit, wrestled with the conflicting emotions churning within her. Part of her still struggled to reconcile the officer she'd known, the one who'd shown promise early in his career, with the man who'd become a symbol of everything wrong within the department. She knocked, the sound echoing in the stillness of the apartment. After a long moment, the door creaked open, revealing Timons, a ghost of his former self. He looked at her, a flicker of something akin to shame in his eyes. "Captain," he mumbled, his voice raspy and used. "Brad," Harper replied, her voice quiet but firm. She stepped into the apartment, the air thick with the smell of stale alcohol and defeat. "I came to tell you," she paused, searching for the right words, "that Sergeant Freeman refused to press charges." Timons looked up, his eyes widening in disbelief. She didn't?" he stammered, the question hanging in the air. "No," Harper confirmed, her gaze steady. "She said it wasn't about personal retribution. It was about accountability, about changing the system that allowed this to happen in the first place." A wave of emotion washed over Timons, shame mingling with a strange sense of relief. He'd expected anger, vengeance, a public flame. Instead, he'd been met with mercy. He sank onto the sofa, the weight of it all threatening to suffocate him. Harper watched him, a mixture of pity and weariness in her eyes. She gave you mercy when she could have given you war, she said, her voice low, each word a heavy stone dropped into the silence. Think about that. She turned to leave, pausing at the door. Don't waste it. The precinct hummed with a different kind of energy now. It wasn't the boisterous, backslapping atmosphere of before, but something more measured, more thoughtful. Nyla Freeman sat at her desk, reviewing the final reports on the Timans investigation. The satisfaction she felt wasn't about revenge. It wasn't about personal triumph. It was about the ripple effect, the subtle but significant shift she'd witnessed within the department. Officers were more cautious, more aware of their actions and the potential consequences. Conversations about accountability and ethical conduct, once hushed whispers, were now taking place openly. There was a newfound respect for the Internal Affairs Department, a recognition of its vital role in maintaining the integrity of the force. The change wasn't dramatic, it wasn't a complete overhaul. It was a seed planted, a slow but steady growth towards a better future. Nyla leaned back in her chair, closing her eyes for a moment. The fatigue of the past weeks settled over her, but beneath it, a quiet sense of hope began to bloom. She knew the fight wasn't over, that there would be more challenges, more battles to be fought. But for now, this small victory, this subtle shift in the tide, was enough. It was a testament to the power of integrity, a reminder that even in the face of adversity, one person could make a difference. She opened her eyes, her gaze settling on the framed motto on her desk: "Justice delayed is justice denied." Today, justice had been served, not just for herself, but for the future of the precinct, for the community they were sworn to protect. And in that, she found a profound and enduring sense of peace. The fluorescent lights of the briefing room hummed, a dull counterpoint to the silence that had settled over the space. Nyla sat alone at the long table, the polished surface reflecting the faint shadows under her eyes. She could almost feel the echoes of the recent commotion, the hushed whispers, the tense faces, the palpable weight of the investigation that had just concluded. Timans was gone, not just from the precinct, but from the force entirely. The news had spread like wildfire, leaving a strange vacuum in its wake. A part of her, the part trained to compartmentalize and focus on procedure, felt a sense of quiet satisfaction. Justice, however delayed, had been served. But another part, a deeper, more visceral part, still throbbed with the memory of that slap. The sting on her cheek had faded, but the humiliation, the raw indignity of it, lingered like a phantom limb. She ran a hand over her face, the gesture almost involuntary, as if trying to erase the memory etched beneath her skin. She glanced at the clock on the wall. Almost midnight. The city outside was winding down, the usual cacophony of sirens and traffic muted by the late hour. She thought about the bystander's video, the one that had ignited the whole affair. How strange that such a small, contained act of violence could ripple outwards, exposing the cracks in a system that had been fractured for so long. Timans had been a symptom, not the disease itself. His dismissal was a victory, yes, but it was a small battle won in a much larger war. Nyla pushed back her chair, the sound echoing in the empty room. She needed air, needed to escape the confines of these walls that held so much unspoken history. Stepping out onto the street, the cool night air washed over her face, a welcome contrast to the stale air of the precinct. The city lights blurred, a shimmering tapestry against the dark sky. She walked slowly, her footsteps echoing on the pavement, each one a small act of reclaiming the space, reclaiming her own sense of self. The investigation had taken its toll. The late nights, the endless interviews, the subtle pushback from those who still clung to the old ways, it had all worn her down. She had faced skepticism, even hostility, from within her own ranks. There were those who saw her as a traitor, a disruptor of the established order. Their silence, their averted gazes, spoke volumes. But there were others too, others like Detective Saunders, who finally found the courage to speak up, to break the code of silence that had protected Timans for so long. And Captain Harper, who, despite her initial hesitation, had ultimately taken a stand. Their actions, small acts of defiance in their own right, had given Nyla a flicker of hope. She stopped at a street corner, the traffic light casting a red glow on the wet asphalt. The city, usually a vibrant, pulsing organism, seemed strangely subdued tonight. Perhaps it was the late hour, or perhaps it was the weight of the events that had unfolded. Nyla closed her eyes, taking a deep breath. The scent of rain lingered in the air, a clean, earthy fragrance that seemed to wash away the lingering tension. She thought about the future, about the long road ahead. The work was far from over. Timon's dismissal was just the beginning. There were other Timon's out there, other pockets of corruption waiting to be exposed. The system was deeply flawed, and it would take more than one investigation to fix it. But there was a shift happening, a subtle but undeniable shift. The bystanders' video, the public outcry, the internal investigation, it had all forced a conversation, a reckoning that had been long overdue. People were starting to talk, to question the status quo. The code of silence was cracking, and in those cracks, Nyla saw a glimmer of possibility. She opened her eyes, the city lights now appearing sharper, clearer. The red light changed to green, and she stepped onto the crosswalk, the flow of traffic a metaphor for the changes she hoped to see within the force. Accountability, transparency, integrity. These were not just buzzwords. They were the foundations upon which a just system must be built. And it started with speaking up, with refusing to be silenced, with holding those in power accountable for their actions. The fight would be long, and it would be arduous. But Nyla knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her bones, that it was a fight worth fighting. The slap had stung, yes, but it had also awakened something within her, a fierce determination to see justice prevail, not just for herself, but for everyone who had been silenced, for everyone who had been wronged. The city stretched before her, a vast, intricate network of shadows and lights. And within that complexity, within the heart of the system she was sworn to protect, Nyla knew that change was coming. Slowly, perhaps, but inevitably. And she would be there every step of the way to ensure that it did.